All right, guys, Coach Barryline again. We're going to quickly get right into the Revolutionary War. We got a lot to cover in this slide, in this video, so make sure you're paying attention. Pause if you need to, rewind if you need to. But we've got a lot to cram in here, so make sure you're focused, paying attention, and ready to go. All right, so in the Revolution, you had the British Army and the Continental Army, and each army had strengths and weaknesses. The Colonial Army, for instance, had pretty good leadership. They had good officers and generals and things of that nature. They also had the advantage of fighting on their home territory. People fight harder when it's for their home. Also, the alliance with France was an important aspect of the war from the Continental standpoint. It gave us resources and military aid and things of that nature that were crucial to winning the war. Weaknesses: we had a small military that was not well trained, mostly farmers and merchants and things of that nature. We didn't have a whole lot of resources because of our lack of population, and of course had a weak central government. Didn't have the authority to tax, so funding was going to be an issue throughout the war. British Army, on the other hand, had a large, well-trained army, although a lot of it was made up of mercenaries, which becomes an issue for Great Britain. They had lots of resources because they had a global empire that they could draw from. The Loyalists also provided them with a lot of help. And weakness-wise, they weren't fighting on their home territory, so they were in unfamiliar territory and didn't have a clear vision of what they were fighting for sometimes. Everybody in the colonies pitches in during this time. Women especially are involved in boycotts and protests. They often care for wounded soldiers in their own homes. Many of them do fundraising drives to raise money for the army, for food and clothing. Lots of people will knit stockings, or what we would call socks, and bandages for the troops. Some even melted down their pots and pans to make bullets with. And just like all wars, the women are going to be keeping the homes, the farms, the shops, the economy running while the men are off fighting. For their part, black Americans fought in the Revolutionary War as well, but they fought on both sides, British and Americans, and got various offers from both sides for fighting in exchange for freedom at different times. Eventually, the Continental Army has to accept black soldiers too, because they need soldiers, and the British had been offering freedom for people who fought for the British for quite some time. So the Continental Army does come around. The New England regiments are going to be the one with the most African Americans. Generally speaking, African Americans do receive the same pay, clothing, and food rations as whites. However, generally they do menial tasks. They're kept at very low ranks, not allowed to advance throughout the ranks, and most aren't encouraged to re-enlist. But they do fight in sizable numbers on both sides. As for Native Americans, most fight on the side of the British. You have to realize they've been dealing with the colonists for hundreds of years at this point, and have generally gotten raw deals for the most part from them. So they're going to often fight for the British. The Oneidas and the Tuscaroras actually do fight with the colonists, though. But on the frontiers, Loyalists and Native Americans will sometimes join together and fight against the Patriots. In the mountains of Virginia and the Carolinas, where the Cherokee are strongest at the time, they attacked many frontier settlements, and Patriot militias usually often drive them back and begin this process of trying to force the Cherokees move west. Of course, we'll see the Trail of Tears later on. So after Howe was pushed out of Boston earlier on by Washington, he regroups, resupplies, and returns to New York with a force of 300 plus ships and 30,000 British soldiers. Rebels were offered a pardon if they would give in and promise loyalty, but Washington says no thank you. So Howe, with his numerically superior force captures Long Island, takes many Americans prisoner. And in the fall, they continue that march, and Washington's forces are forced to retreat from Manhattan, from New York to New Jersey. Now, in European warfare, most armies didn't fight in the winter, so they would stop fighting in the winter and rest, recover, and train, and do those kinds of things. So Howe had his men in Princeton and a group of Hessian soldiers in Trenton. Washington ignored the conventional European tradition of not fighting during the winter, and on Christmas night of 1776, he surprised the Hessians He snuck his army across the Delaware River, surprised the Hessians during a Christmas celebration, and eventually is going to drive the British out of Princeton, which is a huge victory for the colonial army. The British decide that their best bet is not to necessarily engage the army directly, but to try to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. So Howe attacks Philadelphia with an army of 15,000. He's met by Washington's army of 11,000, but the British win at the Battle of Brandywine Creek. And although Washington's army loses, they do maintain enough strength to continue the fight. So Howe winds up capturing Philadelphia. In Continental Congress, the government is forced to flee the city and move out. Washington and his troops settle in at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for the winter of 1777 to 1778. So the British also, in the summer of 1777, won a major victory at Fort Ticonderoga. They also attacked Fort Stanwix in early August, which became one of the bloodiest battles of the war, but Americans were able to hold there. So, but the British were on an upswing, right? Until October of 1777, you have the Battle of Saratoga. And at that battle, General Burgoyne of the British Army and 5,000 men are surrounded by a superior force led by General Horatio Gates. Burgoyne is unable to break through the lines and is forced to surrender later on that month. The Battle of Saratoga becomes the turning point of the Revolutionary War. The tide is beginning to turn in favor of the colonists starting in late 1777. So at the same time, though, you have a very difficult portion of the war for the American Army. Valley Forge, the soldiers were wintering there, and it was very bitter weather, one of the coldest winters on record in American history. Food was very scarce. The soldiers didn't have good uniforms, and many became ill. Hundreds actually died during that time. So the winter was a tough test of Washington's leadership. His character and common sense, he's able to hold the troops together, and as a result, he gains the admiration of his army. There were some persistent problems for the colonists too. They had persistent money problems because the Continental Congress didn't have the power to tax the people and tax the states, and they printed paper money, but didn't have any backing. So as a result, it was worthless, and prices soared, inflation was rampant, and some farmers, as a result, and more merchants chose to trade with the British, who had coins, silver and gold, but they traded food with the British, which resulted in food shortages for the American army. However, at that same time, many European officers joined the American cause and proved to be really important additions to the American army. You had Baron von Steuben from Prussia, who gave discipline to the troops at Valley Forge through drill and other training methods. And you had the Marquis de Lafayette, who was French, that was an important aide to Washington and an able combat strategist and tactician, for whom Lafayette and Fayette County are named for, as a matter of fact. So while Washington's playing cat and mouse in the northern battles, really the more pivotal battles, the ones that really are going to turn the tide in the favor of the colonies, are going to happen in the west and the south. So 1779, they won some important victories along the Ohio River, or on the north and the west of the Ohio River. In 1778, George Rogers Clark, for whom Clark County is named, led a small force down the Ohio River and captured British settlements at Fort Kaskaskia and Cahokia on the Mississippi River in what is today called Illinois. They also captured a fort and its commander at Vincennes, at the Battle of Vincennes. So those are important victories in the west that caused the British to allocate resources there and weaken the army in the east. And because of the slow going of the war in the north, the British shifted their strategy. They knew that there were a lot of loyalists in Carolinas and Georgia, so they began. At this time, there were a lot of loyalists in Georgia and South Carolina, and the Carolinas, South Carolina in particular. So the British thought that they could consolidate their control of those regions and use them as a base of operations. However, many of those loyalists were not crazy about helping the British because they didn't want to be targeted by their neighbors. So in March 1781, Charles Cornwallis, the British commander of the Southern troops, the British troops in the South, led his army into battle at Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina. And though Cornwallis was victorious, it was a Pyrrhic victory, which means he lost so many troops that he couldn't continue the campaign and was forced to halt the campaign at that time. So an important aspect of the Revolutionary War from a colonial standpoint is the help of European countries, specifically France and Spain. France really bankrolls the American victory in the Revolution. France liked seeing its old enemy losing part of its empire, and it hoped that a British defeat would help make it stronger in Europe as well as throughout the colonies. So initially they sent gunpowder, artillery, and muskets to the Patriots, but Ben Franklin went to Paris to try to get even more help, and he's ultimately successful in his trip to Paris to do so. All right, so after the victory at Saratoga, and because Franklin was so popular and so well received in France, France signed two treaties. One formally recognized the United States as a nation, and the other promised more military help. And they sent 6,000 soldiers to the Americans under the command of French General Count de Rochambeau. So it's not just rock, paper, scissors. It was actually a real historical person named Rochambeau. Spain also helped. The governor of Louisiana, which was controlled by Spain at the time, attacked British forts along the Mississippi and along the Gulf Coast of Florida. Eventually, they do defeat the British troops at Baton Rouge, Natchez, Mobile, and even in Pensacola. So very key victories in the war as a result of help from European allies. In 1781, Washington and Rochambeau received word that Benedict Arnold, one of the colonial's best generals, had actually become a traitor and was leading British raids on Patriot warehouses in Virginia. So Washington sends Lafayette to stop Arnold. After giving up his Carolina campaign, George Cornwallis, who had been the British commander in the Carolinas, moves into Virginia. And anyway, fighting in concert with Arnold, Lafayette actually pushes back Arnold and Cornwallis to the coast, and Cornwallis takes his army to the Yorktown Peninsula and Chesapeake Bay. The plan there is to build a fort and hold out until British ships can come reinforce them or take them to safe harbors in Charleston and New York. So Cornwallis is on the Yorktown Peninsula, and Washington senses an opportunity. He basically has a French admiral by the name of de Grasse establish a blockade behind Cornwallis from the sea, and then Washington and Rochambeau lead a huge force of more than 17,000 soldiers against Cornwallis, who's badly outnumbered. Eventually, after 3 weeks of fighting, Cornwallis surrenders, ending the Battle of Yorktown and, of course, the war itself. The war is officially ended with the Treaty of Paris, which is signed in 1783. It declares the Mississippi River the western border of the United States. Britain formally recognized the U.S. as a nation and agrees to leave its forts in the west. West meaning Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, that area at that time. Spain and France also make peace with Britain. And in return for help during the war, Spain got Florida back from Great Britain. The United States promised to pay what Americans owed British merchants, and the loyalists were actually allowed to reclaim their property losses. So the revolution was successful, except for some groups didn't ever realize the full meaning of it. Women's rights weren't expanded. Equality didn't include them. Married women still couldn't sign contracts or own property, and law still stated that a married woman's property belonged to her husband, no matter if she had it before they got married or not. African Americans are going to make some gains, especially in the northern colonies, where you're going to have laws passed gradually abolishing slavery. However, in the South, most slaves are going to be continue to be in slavery for almost another 100 years. There's certainly going to be huge religious changes after the Revolution. Before, there were official state taxes, but moving forward, you're going to see a much bigger drive towards separation of church and state. And you have a nation that has new problems. They owed a lot of money. The country was deeply in debt. They had to figure out a way to repay it, and they had to set up a central government to allow that to happen. So we'll talk about in the next video of the process by which that government's designed and some of the problems that it faces. We'll see you guys later.